What happens when a young, arrogant rookie cop thinks he can outsmart a seasoned black judge in court? His attempt to flex his authority sparks a chain of events that unravels his career and exposes a deeper truth about power and justice. You won't believe how it all ends. The day started like any other for Judge Edward Walton, the man who made unflappable look easy. Sunlight spilled into his office as he sifted through a pile of drawings sent by a local elementary school. They were heartfelt, colorful, and truthfully a bit chaotic, until one caught his eye. The picture was simple yet striking. A black man stood tall, holding the scales of justice with a calm yet powerful expression. Beneath him, children of all colors stood hand in hand, looking up with admiration. Edward sat back, the drawing in hand, and allowed himself a rare smile. This was why he wore the robe. To show those kids that fairness wasn't just a word, it was a promise. A heavy promise, sure, but one worth carrying. Meanwhile, across town in a police precinct buzzing with the kind of arrogance only freshly pressed uniforms could bring, Officer Bradley Kane was having a moment. The rookie was practically glowing, his chest puffed out like he'd single-handedly saved the world. "Got my first real case today," he announced loudly, tossing the file onto his desk like it weighed nothing. "Hope it's not another screw-up like last week," someone muttered under their breath. Bradley ignored it. He had no time for critics, especially the kind who thought due process mattered. "Judges," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear, "always letting people off the hook, especially the guilty ones. You'll see, I'm going to show them how it's done." Most of the room exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said a word. The thing about arrogance? It tended to be contagious, or at least intimidating enough to keep people quiet. By noon, Bradley had his big break. Jerome Williams, a young black man with a quiet demeanor and a smile that could disarm anyone, found himself shoved into the back of a patrol car. His crime? Attempting to return a shirt he'd accidentally underpaid for at a department store. The cashier's mistake, Jerome's honesty, none of it mattered to Bradley. "They always have an angle," he muttered to himself, cuffing Jerome despite the store manager's protests. Bradley was sure he'd cracked the case of the century. So sure, in fact, that he ignored the security footage that clearly showed Jerome walking up to the counter, receipt in hand. Evidence can be misleading, he told himself, filing the paperwork and feeling every bit the hero. That afternoon, the courthouse buzzed with murmurs. News of Jerome's arrest had spread quickly, and the courtroom was packed. Judge Walton entered the room with his signature quiet authority, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Bradley. The rookie stood by the prosecution's table, shoulders squared, exuding the kind of smug confidence that made Edward's stomach churn. The trial began, and it was chaos from the start. Bradley interrupted the defense attorney at every turn, his tone sharp and dismissive. "Your Honor," the lawyer protested, "this is highly irregular." "Objection," Bradley shot back, even though no one had asked him a question. Edward raised a hand. "Officer Kane, do you understand how objections work?" The question was calm, but his tone carried an unmistakable edge. The room went still. Bradley straightened, his jaw tightening. "I just think it's important we don't let emotions cloud judgment," he said, glancing meaningfully at Jerome. Edward's gaze didn't waver. "Good advice," he said dryly. When the defense presented the security footage showing Jerome's innocence, Bradley didn't flinch. Instead, he doubled down. "Maybe he doctored it," he suggested, his voice loud enough to echo in the silent room. Edward's hands clasped together on the bench, his expression unreadable. "And do you have evidence to support that claim, Officer Kane?" Bradley hesitated, his composure slipping. "Well, no, but—" "No further questions," the defense lawyer interjected, barely concealing their frustration. But Bradley wasn't done. He turned to the judge, his voice dripping with bravado. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I can't help but wonder if your personal connections might be influencing your judgment here." The room gasped. Edward's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Officer Kane, tread carefully. This is a court of law, not a playground for baseless accusations." Bradley leaned back, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He thought he'd scored a point. Edward, however, knew better. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The courtroom felt like it had been hit by a lightning bolt. Officer Bradley Kane's brazen insinuation about Judge Walton's connections hung in the air like an unwanted guest, sending a visible ripple of discomfort through the audience. A few people shifted in their seats, while others simply stared, wide-eyed, at the rookie cop who had just crossed the line few would dare approach. Judge Walton didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His piercing gaze alone could have silenced a riot. "Officer Kane," he began, his tone measured but steely, "this is a court of law. Professional conduct isn't a suggestion here, it's a requirement. You'd do well to remember that." Bradley shrugged, flashing a smug smile as if he hadn't just walked into a trap of his own making. But inside, doubt was creeping in, chipping away at his overconfidence. The room's energy had shifted, and he could feel it, though he wasn't ready to back down just yet. The defense attorney, who had been simmering with restrained frustration, seized the opportunity. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that directly contradicts Officer Kane's allegations against my client." With a nod from Walton, the lawyer queued up the surveillance footage. The grainy video played on the screen, showing Jerome Williams calmly approaching the cashier, receipt in hand. Every move screamed innocence. No fumbling, no hesitation, no attempt to hide anything. For a moment, there was silence. Then came Bradley's response. "He had time to cover his tracks," he said flatly, folding his arms. "Guys like him always have a backup plan." Gasps rippled through the room. Jerome's mother, seated in the back, let out an audible cry of disbelief. Walton's eyes darkened, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Officer Kane," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through steel, "are you implying that the evidence itself is tampered with? Because if so, that's a very serious allegation, one that requires proof." Bradley hesitated. His mouth opened, but no words came out. It was the first time his confidence faltered in front of the crowd. After a tense adjournment, Walton retreated to his chambers, only to be met by Jerome's mother, waiting just outside. She was a petite woman, but her presence was immense. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her son's school photo in one hand and her purse in the other. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling, "I just wanted to thank you for seeing my boy as more than they make him out to be." She paused, swallowing hard. "Not everyone does." Walton felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. He nodded, his voice soft yet firm. "He deserves the same justice as anyone else. That's not a favor. It's a right." As she walked away, Edward lingered in the hallway. Her gratitude was a reminder of why he fought so hard, but it also underscored a bitter truth. The system wasn't just broken. It was rigged, and it was people like Jerome who paid the price. The following day, Walton convened an emergency hearing with Bradley's supervisor, Captain Ellis. The captain entered the courtroom with a forced smile and visible discomfort, clearly torn between loyalty to his officer and the undeniable weight of the evidence. Under questioning, Ellis reluctantly admitted that Bradley had been the subject of multiple complaints, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional conduct. "Nothing ever came of it," he added quickly, as if that would soften the blow. But it didn't. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Walton leaned forward. "And why, Captain Ellis, were these complaints not escalated?" Ellis stammered, fumbling for an answer. We believe they were minor infractions, Your Honor. Nothing to warrant disciplinary action." Bradley, seated nearby, visibly bristled. His face reddened as the room's focus shifted squarely onto him. He rose abruptly, his voice loud and accusatory. "This is a witch hunt!" he shouted. "You're all out to get me because I'm not afraid to do my job." Walton raised a hand, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Bradley's outburst. "Sit down, Officer Kane," he commanded. His voice wasn't raised, but the authority behind it left no room for argument. For the first time, Bradley hesitated before obeying. The cracks in his armor were becoming impossible to ignore. Judge Edward Walton leaned forward on the bench, his gaze sweeping across the packed courtroom. The murmurs had faded, replaced by an almost eerie silence. Then came his announcement, calm, deliberate, and yet carrying the force of a thunderclap. "This court will conduct a public hearing into the actions of Officer Bradley Kane. Transparency is not a favor, it's an obligation." The room erupted. Some gasped, others whispered furiously, while a few exchanged knowing glances. A public hearing? Against a cop? That was the kind of decision that sent ripples through the entire justice system. Walton's expression didn't waver. This wasn't about drama. It was about accountability. It didn't take long for the story to hit every major news outlet. Headlines blared, "Judge Walton takes on rogue officer," and "Public hearing to investigate police misconduct." By the time the hearing date arrived, the courthouse was swarming with journalists, activists, and community members eager to see justice served, or, at the very least, to witness the fallout. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Cameras lined the back of the room, and microphones were poised to capture every word. Bradley Kane entered with a stiff jaw and an even stiffer posture. His uniform, freshly pressed, couldn't mask the weight he was carrying. He knew this wasn't going to be a routine slap on the wrist. The defense wasted no time. They presented security footage, witness statements, and internal reports that painted a damning picture of Bradley's career. There were multiple instances of racial profiling, unwarranted arrests, and excessive use of force. A pattern emerged, and it wasn't pretty. As the evidence piled up, Bradley did what he'd always done. He doubled down. Standing to address the court, he spoke with the same unshakable confidence that had carried him this far. "I've always acted in the interest of the law," he said, his voice loud enough to carry, but not quite steady enough to conceal his nerves. "Sometimes, enforcing the law isn't pretty. It's not easy, but it's necessary." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded reluctantly, but most stared at him with skepticism. Bradley, sensing the room slipping away from him, added, "If doing my job makes me a target, then so be it. I stand by my actions." Judge Walton finally spoke, his tone calm but laced with unmistakable authority. "Officer Kane, the law is not a weapon to wield against the vulnerable. It's a shield to protect them. When you use it to oppress rather than defend, you betray the very principles you claim to uphold." The room fell silent. Walton's words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Bradley's expression faltered, but he quickly masked it with a defensive glare. The hearing reached its boiling point when Bradley's supervisor, Captain Ellis, took the stand. Under questioning, Ellis confirmed what many had suspected but few had dared to say out loud. Bradley's record was riddled with complaints that had been swept under the rug. "We failed to address them," Ellis admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "And for that, I take full responsibility." The crowd buzzed with indignation. Ellis's admission was a bombshell, and Bradley knew it. His confidence cracked further, and for the first time, he looked like a man who understood just how deep the hole was that he dug for himself. Judge Walton took this moment to address the room. His voice was steady, but his words carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. When those entrusted with power abuse it, they don't just harm individuals. They erode the trust of an entire community. That trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair. It is the duty of this court, and every person in this room, to ensure that power is held accountable. Because without accountability, justice is nothing more than an illusion. The room erupted into applause. It wasn't the polite, scattered kind. It was a standing ovation, loud and unanimous. Walton remained seated, his expression calm but resolute. This wasn't a moment for celebration. It was a reminder of how much work remained to be done. In the end, Bradley Kane was stripped of his badge and barred from serving in law enforcement. His supervisor issued a formal apology to Jerome Williams and his family, standing before the court and the cameras to acknowledge the department's failings. Jerome's mother wept quietly as she hugged her son, her tears a mixture of relief and lingering pain. Walton watched from the bench, his expression unreadable. Justice had been served, but he knew better than anyone that this was just one case in a sea of many. As the courtroom emptied, Walton remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the scales of justice engraved on the wall. The fight for fairness wasn't over. It never would be. But today, at least, they'd won a battle.